how good is the new Tokyo Revengers? And of course, when I say that, obviously Astro Royale isn't a sequel to Tokyo Revengers. But because that series was so popular, and because of how controversial its ending was, everyone was ready to jump on this manga as soon as it was announced as one of Shonen Jump's new series. That's why in this video I'd like to share my first impressions after the first 2 or so chapters and discuss whether Astro Royale is as bad as people want it to be, or if it's really worth reading. Now, like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to not talk about Tokyo Revengers when you're talking about Astro Royale. The series is done by Ken Wakoi, who obviously did Tokyo Revengers. And in case you aren't aware, Tokyo Revengers went from probably the most hyped up manga, besides like JJK and One Piece, to one of the most irrelevant manga. Without getting into any spoilers, basically what happened is that Tokyo Revengers reached a point in the story where fans felt it was time to wrap things up. But then it entered a new arc and everyone mostly agreed that it was redundant, recycled, and simply not as good as everything before. Couple that with the popular opinion that it's one of the corniest stories in manga, and Tokyo Revengers ended on a pretty sour note. Which is why when Wakoi announced his new series in Shonen Jump, people were quick to hop on Twitter and claim that his new manga was already trash. Now, I fully recognize that this has no bearing on the actual quality of the story. First of all, this is not a sequel to Tokyo Revengers. Second, you do not need to know anything about Tokyo Revengers to check out Astro Royale. They are 2 separate series, meaning we can judge them on their own merits. But even acknowledging that, I think it's important to still have that context in mind going into this series. 1, because it's always going to be part of the narrative when people discuss this series. And 2, because there seems to be a lot of similarities between Astro Royale and Tokyo Revengers. So on that note, let's start with what I like about this series, namely the premise. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So the premise of Astro Royale is something like this. The story centers around Hibaru, the biological son of a major Yakuza crime boss. When we meet Hibaru, his father has passed away and he and his many adopted siblings are conducting their father's funeral. Since Hibaru was the last one to speak with his father, everyone wants to know who he decided would inherit the family business. But while Hibaru was actually named as successor, he declares that his adopted brother Tarasu was named new head of the family. But then after the funeral, a meteor shower hits Tokyo, causing major damage across the city and nearly killing Tarasu. But before that happens, Hibaru is seemingly granted a wish by a star and is given a crazy new superpower, basically giving him super strong punches. Following this event, the 2 brothers discover that many of their siblings also gained new powers, which have been dubbed Astros, and now they all want to compete for control of the family, hence the name Astro Royale. And you know, I like how the story starts out. I like the way the characters get these powers. First, it was something you had to wish for, so not everyone gets it. But at the same time, a lot of characters seem to have gotten the power. So it's not like a lot of stories where the main character goes from having no powers to having some kind of busted ability. It seems like there's an even playing field for the most part. As a matter of fact, and I know this is gonna sound like a weird comparison, but it kind of feels like this is a mix between Tokyo Revengers and Static Shock. Because in Static, they all got their powers from the Big Bang event, and it wasn't just good guys and bad guys, it was just a whole bunch of different people. Now, I also like where the plot is headed so far. It seems pretty obvious that a lot of the early story will be Hibaru fighting the other siblings and their new powers. But it's not just the good guys versus the bad guys necessarily. It's a battle royale, so there's a lot of room for alliances and some politics here and there. So when I finished these first 2 chapters, I felt that Astro Royale had a solid start. Decent first chapter, and this was also true for the second chapter. And when you go online, this seems to generally be the consensus among most people who have read it. But that isn't to say Astro Royale doesn't have its issues. One thing that personally bothers me is some of the art. First off, let me just say that I have not read the Tokyo Revengers manga. I'm only caught up on the anime, so I can't speak to the art in the manga. But so far, when I'm reading Astro Royale, I have these bittersweet feelings about the art. On the one hand, I generally like how Ken Wakoi designs characters. I really like the character designs in Tokyo Revengers, and for the most part, I like them in Astro Royale too. But there are parts where the characters look really cool, and then there's other parts where, to quote my favorite show, Trailer Park Boys, they look like these weird twiggy alien things. Other than that, I think the art is just fine. In fact, I really don't have anything bad to say about it in particular. I just happen to notice that when I'm reading it, the art kinda feels hit or miss. Another thing I have to point out is that there are a lot of characters already. I've noticed that in a good number of shonen manga, writers like to throw out a bunch of characters at first and then come up with their stories later. It's what Horikoshi did in My Hero, Tabata kind of did it in Black Clover. You see it all the time. Now, am I accusing Wakoi of making all these characters without planning them out? No, I mean, it's only the first few chapters. But one of my concerns is that we're only a few chapters in and there's already at least a dozen important characters. And more often than not, what ends up happening is that some of these characters get propped up to be important and then they get underutilized. So while there's no concrete proof that this is going to happen anytime soon, that concern is definitely in the back of my mind as I follow this manga. Now, having said that, I think Wakoi is doing a good job with Hibaru as the main character. I would say he's a decent protagonist so far. Personally, he feels like he combines all of the best parts of Mikey and Takemichi. He's compassionate and dorky, but he's really strong and has this gangster with a heart of gold vibe. I also like how Wakoi builds this connection between Hibaru and his father, because with Mikey, it was him and his brother, so Mikey always wanted to be like his older brother. And in Astro Royale, you have the father. He's a Yakuza boss, but he fights with his fists, would rather make friends with people, and has respect for tradition and the old way of doing things. Maybe you didn't have Yakuza in your neighborhood growing up, but he feels like someone we all know, which is why having Hibaru inherit his legacy and wanting to be like his father gives him a certain charisma. I also like Tarasu as a side character too, although truth be told, he just feels like a reskinned Chifuyu. Like as soon as I saw him, I was like, okay, so this is just Chifuyu, right? He's the more rational advisor to the main character, so he's just Chifuyu too, right? All jokes aside, I don't have too much more to say about Tarasu. I like his dynamic with Hibaru, but I can't really say much else until we see how his character is fleshed out. On that note, I do have some thoughts as far as the potential of this series. First of all, I think what's going to make or break this series are the fights. That's just the way it is. It's how Jujutsu Kaisen got so popular, it's why Demon Slayer got so popular, it's why a bunch of other Jump manga got as popular as they did. Right now, I think the action in Astro Royale is solid considering we're just getting into the story. My big concern is how Wakoi will manage to keep things fresh. Because Hibaru's power is punching people, and so far he kinda just beats people in one punch. So if every fight is just going to be Hibaru figuring out an enemy's weird ability and beating them in one punch, then that's going to get really old really fast. Obviously, another concern I have is the side characters. I mentioned that we already have a lot of characters, so part of how well the story does will hinge on how well Wakoi can use everyone besides Hibaru. But considering how good the characters in Tokyo Revengers are, I'm not too worried about that. Finally, I have a couple questions going forward for this manga. First, I'm wondering what the longevity of this manga is going to be like. With Tokyo Revengers, it was solving a murder, so it was a bit broader. Here in Astro Royale, it's becoming the crime boss. So the focus seems a bit more narrow. So I'm wondering what kind of direction Wakoi takes the story in and how long he wants to keep it going. Assuming, of course, that it does well and avoids the notorious acts of Shonen Jump. Finally, and I know we talked about this, but we need to see how Astro Royale separates itself from Tokyo Revengers. Again, it doesn't need to answer anything about Tokyo Revengers and its problems. But as you've noticed, there's already a lot of similarities. So on top of things like the action and the plot, I think part of the success of this story will hinge on how Wakoi distinguishes this manga from his previous one and manages to sort of break away from his comfort zone in a sense. But overall, I'm pretty confident in Astro Royale so far. It's got a decent start, I like the premise, I think Hibaru is a solid protagonist so far, but I'm genuinely excited to see where the story is headed and what direction this manga takes in the next year. So now I'd like to hear what you think. What was your first impression of Astro Royale? What would you say its potential is? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my other video on Tokyo Revengers. In that video, I explain how bad manga can ruin good anime. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.